So yeah, so what essentially I was trying to say is that, you know, there's frustration building up because of the time it's taken to actually provision a data service on behalf of somebody who wants to use it. And then what tends to happen is, because of this frustration is building up, they'll go off and do their own thing. So they'll find a VM that they have access to, they'll find some container image of a data service online, and they'll just go and deploy it and say, ah, to hell with IT, I'll just go and do my own thing. So now you have this other side of the equation where you've absolutely no idea what's being run inside in your infrastructure. So you have no insight into the data services, the databases. You don't know whether there's any kind of life cycle, or the end user going to patch it, if patches come out, or the security concerns, all of that kind of stuff. So that's what we think we'll be able to alleviate with Data Services Manager. Firstly, if an app developer or end user or DBA, whatever, wants to provision a data service, they can do it very rapidly, very quickly. But also the infrastructure administrator, in this case, or vSphere administrators, have the ability to control the resources that are being consumed. They have the ability to put the guardrails around your vSphere infrastructure to make sure that whatever is being provisioned from a data services perspective, it's not going to stomp all over your vSphere infrastructure and use, you know, excessive amount of resources. So that's the premise. And what I'm going to show you now is basically how we've re-architected, what's going on under the covers, a couple of demos to show you the vSphere administrator's perspective of Data Services Manager, and then the app user, developer, DBA's perspective of how they consume it as well. So again, it could change from the demos I've used because we're still, you know, in a milestone phase. We don't have a beta. We're not quite at GA, as I mentioned, just yet. So it might subtly change, but not really change too much. So again, this is what we think will happen. We hopefully will be able to address the concerns that I've just outlined, both for the vSphere admin and for the end users. So have a look at the Data Services Manager product itself. Let's build it out. I think we all know what these things are. So this is our vSphere infrastructure. There will be a vCenter server. I don't know if anyone wants to move closer, if they're finding this hard to see. Just come on up. Don't bite or anything. But that's essentially our vSphere infrastructure, and any kind of the vSphere storages you can imagine, the data stores there we support. So it's vSAN, vVols, VMFS, NFS, no big deal. So it comes as an appliance. So we roll out an OVA, virtual appliance, and that has a client extension. I can't think of the term, but it plugs it. vSphere client plugin that connects back to vCenter. So essentially there is communication going on between this appliance and your vCenter server regarding the infrastructure, because we'll be able to bubble up all sorts of information in the UI that's associated with the Data Services Manager. So let's assume that there is a request to roll out a clustered Postgres database. So in other words, a Postgres database that has replication. And the reason you might want to have that is that if you're going to patch that database, it remains online while it goes through a rolling upgrade. So what will happen in that case is that, first of all, we want to make sure that what is being deployed remains within guardrails, remains within a subset of resources. We want to make sure it doesn't step all over our vSphere infrastructure. So we have this concept called an infrastructure policy. And the infrastructure policy is the remit of the vSphere administrator. So the vSphere administrator from the vSphere client will build an infrastructure policy which says compute, storage, networking, VM class, so size of VM is in there as well, and that'll be the infrastructure policy. And we'll see later that when we come to provision this database, one of the things that you will have to select as the consumer of the database or the data service is the infrastructure policy, which means that the data service that's provisioned remains within that subset of resources. Does that all make sense? Cool. And the demos will probably emphasize this a bit more anyway. So we now have an infrastructure policy. We're going to now introduce the DB admin, the data admin, whatever you want to call it, that person who's responsible for provisioning out data services. And from within the UI, or actually the API as well, they have all of these tools available for managing the data services. So we can do the lifecycle management of the databases and data services, so patching them and upgrading them and so on. We have the ability to do automated backup and restores of those data services, can clone them. We have monitoring and metrics as well that are not VM level metrics, but more data service level metrics. So if it's a database, you can see things like, you know, rows that are created, rows deleted, those kind of things, whatever is relevant to that data service. So they come along and they'll say, well, I now have a request, or I have a need for a data service, so I'm going to request that this Postgres database is deployed in a replicated state. And so what happens then is we provision a Kubernetes cluster to back this data service. So in this case, because it's replicated, we're doing 3 VMs. So 3 virtual machines are being created, and this forms a Kubernetes cluster. We then have what's known as an operator for each of the data services, and that operator knows about deploying Postgres, knows about deploying MySQL, knows about, or will know about the additional data services that we're going to add going forward. So essentially what we do is we stand up a database on that Kubernetes cluster, but all of the management is done through that portal that we have to DSM, the Data Services Manager. So again, if it's Postgres and there's a Postgres patch comes out, we can do the patching. If we need to do backups and restores of this database, we can do that as well. And we can have all the monitoring and metrics associated too. So that's just one example. You could have MySQL, and perhaps it is just test and dev, so I don't need to have it replicated. It's just going to be a, you know, very quick, stand it up, do some work, and I'm going to throw it away again. So you could have standalone using a completely different infrastructure policy. So it could be on a completely different cluster, different storage, different port groups. And again, we did announce support for Google's Alloy DB as well. They have an on-prem version called Omni. So we're going to have that as tech preview in the initial release very early next year. So again, that's how we see it all tying together. But there's another user that we haven't discussed yet, and we talked about it just very briefly in the intro, which is this end user or developer or consumer. So we have the ability, we have a full-blown API for all of this. So if an end user didn't want to be using the UI, the portal or whatever, they can absolutely use the API. That's a fully Kubernetes-based API, which you can integrate with ARIA automation, or if you're comfortable using the Kubernetes API, you can do, you know, standing up databases, cloning databases, scaling out and databases, all of that from the Kubernetes API as well. So far, so good? Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of more details about. So this is the infrastructure policy. I remember it's basically putting guardrails about resources that can be consumed. So the things that you see in here, the compute, you know, folders as well. You might want to put those Kubernetes clusters that we're standing up, those set of VMs that we're standing up for the data services. We also have, as I said, the storage policies. Absolutely, storage policies, you tend to associate them mostly with vSAN and vVols, but you can absolutely use a concept called tag-based policies to associate them with VMFS and NFS as well. So we will support any backend storage, essentially. Port groups, now distributed port groups are required, so you will need a distributed switch in order to do this, because we expect to be able to deploy these data services across multiple clusters as well, not just multiple hosts. So what we want is distributed port groups to go across the whole of the infrastructure. And last but not least, we have this concept of a VM class, and this is simply defining the size of the virtual machine, because what will typically happen is if you give somebody a bunch of resources, they'll build the biggest thing possible. You know, you come across this monster VM guy, right? So the VM class, and if you've done vSphere with Tanzu, don't confuse the two. It's just we're using a similar concept that's in vSphere with Tanzu, which is defining the size of a VM, but there is no vSphere with Tanzu here. There's no Tanzu at all. Actually, the Kubernetes that we're deploying is actually upstream vanilla Kubernetes. Okay, so there's no Tanzu associated here whatsoever. That makes sense? Okay, cool. And so really, the other thing we wanted to do is not only put guardrails around what resources could be consumed, but also give visibility. So here anytime there's a data service is stood up, whether it's a database or some of the other ones that we'll talk about shortly, we should be able to get full visibility into those data services from the vSphere client as well. So this is still the persona of the vSphere administrator using the vSphere client, not just to set up the infrastructure policies, but see how they're being consumed. Okay? And you can break these out as well, because it will show you the role of each of the different VMs. Like I said, you could have a standalone database with a single VM, a single Kubernetes node, or you could have a clustered one. And we'll show you the role of each of those VMs in that Kubernetes cluster, in that database deployment as well. So is it the primary, is it a replica? All of that stuff is all going to be visible in the vSphere client. Okay. So let's do a very quick demo. So this is what we expect the vSphere client to look like. So you can see some new stuff in here related to Data Services Manager. This is when the plugin is enabled, and you can see I'm examining just some existing infrastructure policies already. So just to show you the kind of stuff that you put into them, like the storage policy, the network port groups. So we have this concept as well of an IP pool. So what you'll be able to do is set aside a set of IP addresses that are associated with a port group, and then as the services are stood up, they will consume the IP addresses from that pool. And then the VM classes, you can see you can actually create, we'll look at that shortly, but you can create your own VM class as well. You don't have to go with these cookie cutter or t-shirt sized ones that we have supplied. So again, we'll just build a new one here. I'll just call this one the VMUG demo. And again, I'm just going to select a cluster. You could select a resource pool. So if you wanted a data service to be associated just with a resource pool, you could do that, but I'll just pick the whole cluster in this case. And then you can see lots of storage policies. Like I said, vSAN is very commonly associated with storage policies, as are vVols, but you could absolutely use the tag-based policies to select VMFS and NFS here as well. You do need, again, reiterating the fact that we do need a distributed port group. So you just select the port group that you want the data services to plumb up on, and select the range of IP addresses that you want to allocate out. And we take care of all of that once it's been configured. Last thing then really is just the VM-centric settings. So which folder, and then do I want to create some additional VM classes, or will I just pick some of the cookie cutter ones that I already have? So we allow you to do that. And that's essentially it then. So we've now set aside a set of resources that can be consumed by our end users for provisioning data services. So what we want to put into that infrastructure policy means those are the only resources that we're allowing the end users or the DBAs or whatever to consume when they're building out these policies. Yeah, sure.
Is there a reverse sort of conception of this, that resources that are allocated, like a cluster, data stores and so on, are not available for general purpose deployment, outside of DSM? Are they sort of allocated to and consumed by and unavailable, or could I notionally still choose a resource pool or a data store that DSM has for something either by design or by accident? Are they sort of...
So you can build lots of these different resource pools. So if you had lots of clusters, or you had lots of, you could build lots of these infrastructure policies is what I meant. But the granularity is that they could have multiple clusters, they could have single clusters, they could have multiple resource groups, resource pools, they could have single resource pools, and anything that's not included in an infrastructure policy cannot be consumed.
Sure, but outside of DSM,
right.
If I wanted to deploy, for example, a SQL VM
okay.
outside DSM onto the resource pool that DSM has allocated.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Still do that by design or by accident.
You could through the yes, you could absolutely. So the only place the guardrails apply is within DSM, which we'll see now. We'll see the DBA side of things now when we go into the DSM portal next. So what will happen is what we've just built here will bubble up into the DSM portal. So we expect the DSM portal will be the one-stop shop for the provisioning of the data services. You won't be provisioning the data services outside of that. There is nothing to stop. That's correct.
Another subsidiary one. It's not VCF only, is it? This is for general.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a big push on VCF because I think of how the Broadcom reorg is going to look at what VMware is going to turn out like afterwards. So VCF has got a lot of focus, which is why you've seen it mentioned in the context of VCF.
I was saying this was only for VCF, but no,
you can. No, it's completely standalone, but there is a push to talk about VCF a lot more than we have been doing, if I can be politically correct and kind of say it like that. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah. But absolutely, it's just a vSphere product. Yeah, for sure. But if you look at a lot of the collateral that came out of Explore, VCF is there, and then there's Data Services Manager above it. So you would make that assumption that there's a connection, but there's not. Yeah, go ahead.
Question about replication, but from a DBA perspective.
Right.
Is that something we are tackling now or will be in the future?
Yeah, so we decide, and we'll see it in the next part, whether you want a standalone database or whether you want to have a replicated database.
And that's replicated at the storage layer as opposed to up at the Golden Gate? Sort of.
No, it's replicated at the application layer. So it's the application that we provision. So Postgres will take care of its own replication, or MySQL will take care of it.
Thank you.
But of course, with vSAN, you could also have replication at the storage layer, or whatever storage you like. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just asking if SQL Server and Oracle, are they going to be in scope?
So we had SQL Server in 1.x, but there's how I think that Microsoft wants you to use their mechanism of replicating only. So they're, and I think they're only making it available in Azure. So it's SQL Server on Linux using containers is the Microsoft SQL we're doing. It's not Windows, and that's exactly how they do it in Azure. But their replication mechanism is not freely available for everyone else to use, if I can put it like that. Again, I'm trying to be very politically correct. So we are still planning to do Microsoft SQL on Linux, but it won't be in the 2.0 version that we're releasing initially. What we'll have initially in the 2.0 version is Postgres, is MySQL, the tech preview for Google's AlloyDB Omni, and then after that, in the forthcoming release, we're planning to do Minio Object Store as a data service as well. And then going down the line, yeah, there are plans afoot to do Microsoft SQL Server on Linux. And we keep getting asked about MongoDB as well. But no commitments, by the way. Remember what I said right at the beginning, that don't base any purchasing decisions on what you hear today. But these are what we're hearing. And so, you know, almost every time we present this and we ask what other data services, Mongo comes up all the time. So, but that's our sort of plan into next year for the moment, if that makes sense. Oracle is completely different. I mean, what we're talking about here are essentially like open source databases that you can, you know, very quickly roll out and monitor and so on. Typically, organizations that have Oracle already have a team of people for Oracle. What we're looking at here, and I personally feel it, is that you as a vSphere administrator could not only set aside these infrastructure policies as guardrails, but you could actually roll out these databases and data services on behalf of end users as well, as long as we put enough guardrails and so on around it. This is exactly what we did with vSAN 10 years ago. We said, we're planning to give you ownership of the storage. We're going to give you all the bells and whistles and all of the tooling that you need to do that in the vSphere client. Now we're stepping it up to the data services that perhaps sit on that storage layer. And what we're planning to do is give you all of the tooling that you need to do that as well. All right, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great, okay. I'm just very conscious of the time because I think we started a little bit late. So the data services, I kind of done this just a moment ago, telling you what we plan to have in the 2.0 release. We definitely have the Postgres SQL and the MySQL. Tech preview of AlloyDB is coming in the initial release, and then shortly afterwards, when we do a 2.1 or whatever, 2.0a, whatever we decide to call it, we'll have Minio in as a tech preview, and we expect to have AlloyDB as a fully GA and available data service as well. And then after that, as I said, who knows? So we're just, you know, we're gathering feedback from our customers. What else would you like to see in here? But I expect this could become like a sort of marketplace where we have lots and lots of these different data services that you just click on to deploy out. Cool. So again, if I'm going to do a data service or a database, you see the kind of things that are in here. So just some basic stuff. Here's where you would select whether it's standalone or whether it's replicated, that kind of thing. But more importantly, I think the infrastructure policy, the policy that we just built in the vSphere client is now bubbled up this is the DSM UI. We now select which of those policies we wish to provision onto, and basically which resources we want to consume. There's a few other things in here as well. I mentioned that we have backup and restore capabilities, we have lifecycle management. All of those are turned on automatically. So we will automatically start backing up any data service that you provision. There'll be a full backup initially, and then we'll start doing incremental backups until the retention period expires, and then we'll start with full and go through that all again. Same for lifecycle management. So we have this thing called auto minor updates. Minor version updates. So essentially, if Postgres or MySQL or whatever data service we support bring out a patch, we will release an updated version of the data service for you. That becomes visible in the UI. You can alert on it and all of that good stuff. But we set aside a maintenance window, which is 1 a.m. on a Sunday morning, that will automatically update the data services for you if you choose to leave that option enabled. So we don't do major version upgrades. That tends to be, something that people want to control and manage and do on their own. But the minor versions, so if it's like PostgreSQL going from a 15.2 to a 15.3 or something like that because there's a security issue or whatever, and patch comes out, we can take care of that automatically for you. Cool, okay. And advanced settings. So typically vanilla Postgres, vanilla MySQL. Not everybody wants to just do vanilla. There's always going to be some sort of subset of advanced configuration options that they want to enable. You can do the whole shooting match in here as well. So you can add in any of the advanced options that you want for those databases. Typically a lot of them are to do with statistics and exporting extended statistic information, so you can see what's happening with tables and all that kind of thing. So you can do all of that from our portal as well. So we have a demo here as well. This is what our Data Services Manager UI will probably look like, something like this. So it's just a matter of logging in, and you'll notice that there's a bunch of things not updating just yet. But the idea is that you can see the users. We support LDAP users here as well. You can see the different infrastructure policies. I think our VMUG one is in there. And these are databases that have already been provisioned. You can see you could step through them, and we expect MySQL and Omni and all of those ones to be up there. So we're going to create a Postgres database. We support a whole bunch of different Postgres versions, so you just select which one you want, give it a name, decide whether the topology is just a single or whether it's replicated. That's the single vSphere cluster where we replicate across it. I'll just do a single one here. Yeah, so we do create a default user with it. And now because we have multiple infrastructure policies, you can select which policy you want. And if we had associated multiple storage policies, if we had associated multiple VM classes, like you just saw there, you would get the opportunity to select which of those you wish to include when you're provisioning the database. So you could decide that you can provision to VMFS and vSAN, but not vVols, so you just include those policies. And that's what I mentioned as well about the automatic updates, lifecycle management. You can see it's all in there. You can turn it on or off, whatever the case may be. And you can also customize the database options just by putting in the advanced parameters there. So you can just put in those parameters, like I think I'm doing a max connections just to show you. I think it might be 100 by default. So you might want to reduce it to, I don't know. I'm not a DBA. I have no idea. I'm just making stuff up. But it was just to show you that. What you can do, okay? And there we go. And I don't think we're going to hang around waiting for the whole thing to deploy out. But now behind the scenes, what we talked about in the architecture slide, we'll roll out a VM, we'll install Kubernetes, we have the Kubernetes operator, we'll deploy the data service, bada bing, and you now have your data service deployed.
Cool, mate. One quick question.
Of course.
Will there be the option to deploy a specific version of Postgres, for example, like 13.10, as opposed to the latest version of the 13.9?
So I think we will always have just the latest minor version of a major release.
Right, okay.
That's and I think because we're basing it off of Tanzu SQL, which we have as a product already. So those Tanzu SQL versions for Postgres and MySQL, we're just putting out the
Latest version.
Yeah. Would there be a need to have earlier, do you think?
Some of my applications have specifically written and will need additional work to go to later versions or subversions of a particular
Got you. Okay, perfect, perfect. That's good feedback. Thanks for that. Great. So that was vSphere administrator has done the infrastructure policy. We've become the DBA. We've had a look inside in the DSM admin portal. We've now rolled out the database. All I've got left to show you now is just a few bells and whistles about what we have sort of at the back end. So we mentioned things like metrics and monitoring. I just wanted to show you a little bit more about those. So here's the lifecycle management part. So we talked about the auto minor version upgrade capability, but you can still see if we do a new version of those Tanzu SQL products like the Postgres, like the MySQL, if Google give us a new version of their OmniDB or Minio have a new release, we'll be able to put them all up here and alert you to say, hey, look, there is a new patch. Now, if the auto minor version update is enabled, come Sunday morning, this will be done for you. And we'll do it in a rolling upgrade fashion if you have a replicated data service. If it's a standalone data service, well, there'll be downtime while it gets restarted. But you can also just go ahead, go in here, and if you feel, right, this is critical, I actually need to do that right now, you can go and do that as well. So it's just to show you, yeah. So there is the option just to trigger an update immediately if you don't want to wait until Sunday morning. So that's all in there, and I think that's a big part of all of this. We talked about the end users or the developers just standing up their own container image. Who knows what state that is? The thing with this, you have full visibility into all of the data services that are being provisioned out there. The monitoring, alerting, and troubleshooting, yeah, so again, we will highlight stuff in the dashboard for you. So again, you can drill down. What we're hoping to do, you probably won't be able to read that, but there's a thing called a suggestion here. For those of you who have the vSAN health, there's the vSAN health check associated with it. There's a component of the vSAN health check which is actually Ask VMware, which links directly to a KB article. That's what we're hoping to have in here as well. So if there's a situation occurs with any of the data services, what we'll do is we'll take you out into the knowledge bases and give you, well, these are the probable reasons this occurred, and here are things that you might be able to do to address it. So they just plumbed it in as suggestion. It actually doesn't do anything right now, but the objective when it goes GA is this will be like Ask VMware. And again, just the metrics, the monitoring, all of that stuff, it's not VM centric, but more data service centric. So these kind of things are related to the data service, whether they're, as I said, table updates or whatever DBAs look for on a database. Yeah, don't ask me. But the great thing is we can alert on all of this too. So we can send out emails. We have webhooks. So we have webhooks for Slack. So you could send a Slack message, say, hey, something has happened on the database. You might want to have a look. Or ServiceNow. So we can webhook out into ServiceNow as well. So all of that stuff will be in there. And I think you can customize them. So if you're using some other CRM, I think you can just send your custom webhook to send the details to that. Integration with ARIA. I did just want to call that out because at the end of the day, these are just databases. And if you are using vRealize operations or ARIA operations to do any of that stuff, there is an extension to ARIA operations called True Insight. True Insight, is it? True Visibility. True Visibility. I never get it right. It's called True Visibility. I think it came from the Blue Medora acquisition actually way back. So we can just plug those in and yeah, you can get all sorts of weird and wonderful database information again. It can be. I'm sure DBAs would find it useful. I wouldn't have a clue. We have a saying back home, we say you might as well be looking into a field of thistles. But I can plumb it all up. But what it tells me at the end of the day, I'm sure it's useful to somebody. But my point is we can do all that. Thank you very much. We can do all of that with ARIA operations and the True Visibility plugins. Also, we have the ability to do log exporting. Now, I've just plumbed it up here with Log Insight. So we have a Log Insight agent that's available on the appliance itself. So you can send the logs from the appliance directly to Log Insight. But all of the databases are plumbed up with an open source product called FluentBit. I don't know if you've ever come across FluentBit. it can literally ship logs to anything, login site or whatever the case may be. But it's just here in this particular case, we shipped them all into login site, and then of course you can build nice dashboards and alert yourself on stuff that's going on and look for patterns. And again, so we have all of that. That was my only point, is to say we have all of that built into the product as well. So the last part then, of course, is ARIA automation. How many of you do VRA ARIA automation? Okay, okay. Well, it'd be interesting for you at least. But the idea is, I mentioned about the this being a full-blown API to do everything, especially if you're talking about setting something like this up for developers. So you want to give the developers self-service. So you can do all of this through ARIA automation. So with the orchestrator, you can actually build a custom resource that matches directly to Data Services Manager. So all the stuff that we built out, like the infrastructure policies and the end databases and all of that stuff, could be built up through custom resources in the orchestration part of VRA. And you can embed it with other stuff. Essentially, you don't need to just necessarily do database as a service. You could absolutely do that, so you could roll out databases, but perhaps it's a full-blown application that the database is one component. You can do all of that as well. So the Data Service Manager component in the custom resource could be just one part of that custom resource. And the nice thing about it is you can decide, well, I'm going to decide what fields to make available to the end user. In other words, I'm always going to back up everything they do, and I'm always going to leave on AutoMiner version update. I'm not going to give the end users a choice on that because I want those to be on all the time. So you can actually hide those away if you go through this mechanism to do that. So this new request is essentially in the broker. You can pull it out. So you can have there's a service broker part of ARIA automation, and within that there's a catalog. And again, you could, like I said, you could simply have a database as a service, as an item that can be provisioned, or you could have a full data warehouse that has all sorts of applications associated with it as well. It's just to show you that the whole thing can be automated. We have a very extensive API, so even if you're using Terraform or something like that, you'll be able to provision your databases using that mechanism as well. Okay, so yeah, and one last demo to show you, and this is going to scale out a database. So again, it's just to show you the other side. That was the ARIA automation side, but your end users might like to use the Kubernetes API, and it's just really to show you how you can use the Kubernetes API. It's a very simple demo, but the idea is that I started off with just a single node Postgres, and I decided actually I'm going to want to have this replicated. I might think about putting it into production, and that's essentially what we're going to do, is we're just going to scale it out like that. And all we're going to do is we're going to use the Kubernetes API. We're going to retrieve the manifest for that database, and we're going to modify the manifest to reapply it, and off we go. So again, if you can see it here, there's a database. It's got one instance, or one node, I should say, associated with it. Okay. And you can see again that the topology, it's one primary and one monitor. The monitor is just a component of Postgres, but in this particular case, the primary database and the monitor are on a single node. Hopefully you can see that okay. So I'm just querying the clusters from the Kubernetes API. It's exactly what we saw in the UI there. And the one we want to modify is this CJH1. And so I'm in editing it, and I'm looking for this instance count. And you can see, yeah, I don't know if you can see that okay, but we're going to change the number 1 to a number 3. Very simple. And so it goes through its reconfiguration. So we can query it, and we can see that it's actually in it won't be in a ready state. We can watch it there, so you can see the changes in progress. But again, I'll speed this up very quickly. Don't worry, I won't keep you here too long. But the whole idea is through a very simple API call using Kubernetes, kubectl, very easy to just make those changes as well. And we can do all sorts of things. The plan will be to do snapshots and clones and backups and restores all through this Kubernetes API as well. And now what's happened is that we now have 3 nodes. We have a primary, we have a replica, and what we've done is we've moved that that other portion whose name I've forgotten into its own node as well, the monitor. So the monitor gets its own node as well. So you get those 3 VMs backing that cluster now. It's now a 3-node Kubernetes cluster, and the database is replicated across those nodes as well. All good? Okay. Hopefully it was quick and not too boring for you. So that's it for me. I think we're almost on time anyway. So hopefully I've shown you what our plan is and what our hope is to achieve with this product. I'd love to hear from you if some of this, what I'm talking about, is a bit bizarre and doesn't make sense, or if there's something here that we could do, maybe looking at roadmap items and things like that. But hopefully the correlation between the vSphere administrator and the role that the vSphere administrator has here, and then the data administrator, who I also feel could be the vSphere administrator, and then the end users, and how simple it is to consume it then. I mean, we have the UI, the portal to roll out these data services. If you use ARIA automation or anything else that does automation, the API is there for you, or if you prefer to use the Kubernetes extensions, that we can do that as well. But the whole idea is you have full visibility into all of the different data services, and your end users, your developers, they're not getting frustrated waiting for IT to turn around and roll out a database for them. So there's a bunch of, Joe talked about this as well. It was just to talk about this private AI. It's definitely, we see this as part of private AI. I mean, data is essential to all of this. So I think with this sort of product with Data Services Manager and the ability to roll out these data services, we think this could be very interesting. So the one thing about AlloyDB Omni from Google is that they have extensive extensions to their database, which are especially for doing vector DB stuff. But you can also just go open source. The PostgreSQL also has vector DB as well. So there's options available for you, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say. And of course, Minio could be very interesting from a data lake perspective as well. Cool. So if you're interested in any of this, so the slides, we'll be giving the slides to the VMUG team anyway, so these will all be available to you. But if you're interested in getting early access, you want to kick the tires and have a look and see what it's like, we have an early access program, which is the 3rd one there. If you want to just, feel free to sign up for it, is what I'm trying to say. Great. So I think we're almost on the dot. I think we all need some coffee. Thank you very much for finding the room and coming to join us this morning. And I think I'm very easily to find online. So if you have any questions, even after the event, I'm happy for you to reach out to me at any point. So thanks very much.